So I've only got 20 minutes, including Q&A. So really, I think we'll try to make this as easy as possible and to be as engaging as possible. It's a slightly odd format, but I think it is what it is. If you're here to listen and to understand what the trends are with regards to the reporting of nature within Asia-Pacific region, this is where you should be. It's a hard crowd, I gotta say, because it's like me competing against lunch, but we are here for 20 minutes, so if you can stick to that, that's great. Otherwise, understand the recording will also be available. So, as a quick introduction, I'm a botanist by training. I am not an accountant, and numbers isn't really my thing. But by virtue of the fact that I now work with PwC, I think that gives a really good indication as to where things are going around expectation around nature, around disclosure, around expectation of how nature as a component of sustainability risk is being considered. A lot of things. Yesterday, we heard the theme of integration of climate and nature, but also questions on where regulators in the Asia-Pacific region is going around nature. And with that, really to start on this point that we're not really coming from zero on this particular topic, and that there is already growing expectation from regulators around elements to look at risk, to look at how management of nature is being considered within businesses. We can see this from the announcement of Kunming Montreal, so the Global Biodiversity Framework has an expectation or requirement there for financial institutions to be reporting at overall risk and impacts of nature to core business. So that expectation, along with multinational companies, means that we're seeing an increasing pressure around expectation for enhanced reporting on nature. BlackRock, of course, earlier this year had that announcement around natural capital, which again is really taking the message about looking at nature no longer as just an externality, but really looking at what that overall impact is to an organization financially. We've got the TNFD, which I'll go into in a lot more detail, but again, setting up the framework similar to what we're seeing in climate around expectations of reporting for governance, for specific metrics, target setting, but also fundamentally how you're addressing financial implications of nature-related risks to the business. We're seeing mandatory regulatory requirements coming in that are trade-related. I think specifically for this region, the EU deforestation regulation has been a big one, and that's hitting the agriculture sector quite hard. Just in terms of preparation for that, we've got the US Forest Act potentially coming into place, and also now government-related policies related to nature that have been introduced. We've got the Singapore carbon tax that's been in place. Indonesia's carbon trading schemes have also been in place, and Malaysia has recently introduced incentives specifically targeting reforestation and other nature conservation activities. Why it's really important to talk about the message of integration with climate is I think everybody wants to really get into the idea of not being stunned, as many companies were when the TCFD was introduced. When the TCFD was introduced, I think there was a lot of panic from companies around how are we addressing climate, how are we addressing emissions reporting, how are we integrating that within financial impacts. Taking that lesson, what the nature side of things doing is said, okay, we've got a bunch of companies now that are very familiar with the TCFD reporting, a bunch of companies recognizing how you set up strategies, how you start looking at data, and how do you link that with business governance. And so TNFD has decided, which quite rightly I think, to really start to take the framework that's already been in place for TCFD and really use that as the basis for nature reporting. The intent of this is really to say, message one, it's part and parcel of the same risk management decision making. It's part and parcel of the way businesses should be thinking about overall nature-related risks. And finally, it's also meant to align the way in which you report, so you don't have multiple frameworks in place that you're looking at. So additionality there would only be 3 additional things, and that's to do with location specificity, it's to do with enhanced human rights around indigenous communities, and it's also looking at the upstream and downstream impacts in addition to an expansion to also looking at impacts and dependencies as opposed to just risks and opportunities. Now, what we've also been hearing is the fact that nature and biodiversity and ecosystems is going to be the next S standard under ISSB, IFRS. So S3, we know the timeline. ISSB has already announced this. This quarter, in fact, we're expecting the first result of the internal review of biodiversity and ecosystem services in what can be integrated as part of an ISSB reporting format. We've also seen the example of TCFD being taken into S2, and with that, we can see and we can expect that the turning of TNFD into ISSB IFRS S3 is probably going to happen a little bit quicker than other standards. So S4 may be coming a little bit later around human capital, but we know and expect to see the ISSB S3 standard coming a lot quicker. And so with that, if we look at why it's important, is this idea of dependencies, nature dependencies, and how in the Asia-Pacific region, based on research that PwC has done with the Asian Investors Group on climate change, and this is a thought leadership piece that we published last year and actually launched at last year's Ecosperity, is that the vast majority of territories within this region have a much higher dependency on nature in terms of overall market value, right? Again, no surprises there because of where Asia Pacific sits and with the kind of sectors that we have, notably agriculture and other land-based sectors. But I think maybe what is a lot higher than people expect is the overall GVA by moderate to higher level dependency sectors in the region is exceeding 50%, right? And that, if you look at the 2022 numbers, that translates to something like $18 trillion. So it is a huge potential impact to financials. It's a huge potential impact to what businesses really need to consider. And if you take the recent announcement by BlackRock in January around treatment of natural capital, it makes sense that this is where it's going. Interesting to look at the right-hand side where you've got the different sectors that are deemed to have higher and more moderate dependencies on nature. It will be your typical agriculture sectors. It will be sort of your food and beverage, construction, where you've got land-based elements, but also where you've got exposure that's relatively higher. Retail consumer goods, for example, more on the kind of value chain connection on dependency on nature. You're looking at aviation as a sort of link as well to development of airports, for example, but also your resourcing intensity is very high, and that's where those dependencies are. So this overall giving the message that it's not sufficient to just be looking at a small component of sustainability, which is climate, but also important to be looking at what does the nature element impacts and the dependencies mean to overall financial viability of that company. Now, because what we're talking about today is the trends of reporting, I wanted to really show, again, PwC report Sustainability Counts 3, which we released in December last year. And this is a report that we do every year since the last 3 years. And really what we're tracking is how companies in this region are reporting on climate, but also this year for the first time, nature, right? And so what we're seeing here is that a lot of the push within climate disclosure is because of decisions that regulators are making, right? And if you look at like this map here, you can see very clearly overall, you've got adoptions ranging from 2024 to 2025 in Malaysia. Thailand's just adopted it for 2026 for ISSB, Taiwan 2027, Australia 2025. So you can see here that these align very much with targets that countries have to be net zero, right? So that would be this logo here. So aligning with national NDCs is really the intent of where regulators are going. Why this is important is because what we're seeing is the decision-making that regulators make has a real impact on what businesses are taking as important and disclosing. And with that, the ability for us to have a level playing field on looking at overall sustainability performance. We're seeing this within the climate sector, within climate reporting, and we are also seeing this where we're going with nature. And so again, from the same report, currently, there isn't much that is regulation mandatory reporting on biodiversity and nature, right, across Asia Pacific. There may be one or two countries that have maybe biodiversity specific indicators. Case in point, Malaysia has biodiversity indicators specific for agriculture sector and land-based sectors, but it's quite limited in terms of criteria for reporting. But despite that, you still see an interesting trend where it's 62% overall of companies that have been assessed as part of the report are actually reporting on nature-related disclosures in their sustainability reports, right? And that's quite interesting because not a lot of this is mandatory. It's still largely voluntary. And if you look at the top countries that are reporting, Japan leads by far. 94% of companies that were assessed in Japan are already reporting around nature, right? Risks, how are they managing that? Number two is Indonesia. No surprises there because of the agriculture sector, forestry sector, relatively strong. But perhaps slightly interestingly is it is a country that tends to report based on mandatory requirements. And so despite that, you still have a large number of countries, a large number of companies that are reporting on nature disclosure. Third country, again, South Korea, potentially with the exposure to investments. This is sort of the trend that we're seeing around nature reporting. What's interesting, though, is if you look at this in tandem with the climate disclosure trends, now in the same report, and I've not highlighted it here, but in the same report, we've also looked at the year-on-year appreciation, I suppose, of climate-related disclosure. And last year, that number was, let's look at my notes, 81%. So 81% of companies surveyed across the same countries here are already disclosing against management decisions, how they're relating climate risks as part of disclosure, right? That's an upward trend, because the previous year it was 74%. And you could make a kind of correlation there that part of this drive is the move towards the mandatory reporting of either TCFD or ISSB S2, which is now coming into play. What's also interesting with regards to what regulators are deciding on is the implication of this to non-listed companies as well. There are caps, but the expectation of the reporting on climate, but also potentially nature, is going in the same direction. Now, one of the interesting things that I've heard recently, last week, a very prominent NGO had gone on Malaysian business radio to basically say that they didn't believe the TNFD was effective in terms of being able to manage overall nature risks, right? And when pushed to say why didn't they think it was effective, their immediate answer, and again, mind you, this is coming from a very prominent environmental NGO, they said their view was it provides too much of an avenue for companies to do greenwashing. Now, I slightly disagree with that because once you've got a regulated arena for reporting, you actually remove those risks altogether. So actually, what you would tend to see is a leveling of the playing field for companies that are reporting versus those that are not, which means that actually for stakeholders that are interested, such as environmental NGOs, it is a better way of really assessing what companies are actually doing because they're really reporting against the sort of financial impacts, right? What the message that the NGO was saying was, I believe, more about disclosure isn't going to be your only means of talking about your implementation. There has to be a level that you're reporting, but also that you're measuring implementation and whether or not your impacts are there in terms of of what you're putting in place on the ground. So it's this idea of you're honestly making implementation decisions to assess nature risks, but also ensure that they don't become huge and unmanageable. And secondly, you're also reporting that in a way that is transparent so that there is much more avenue to review how companies are actually performing. But it's an interesting point, and one where we probably need more work in terms of ensuring stakeholders like NGOs understand more what the implications are of reporting that is becoming much more regulated and much clearer. Now, this is quite interesting as well, because when you look at what's driving some of that reporting, we believe it's also because of this view to be one of the forerunners within TNFD reporting. And you see it kind of aligns, that the top country with TNFD commitments is indeed Japan. And if we just go back that one slide, you'll see that that aligns with, it's not going back. Yeah. It aligns also with the top country where you've got the most number of companies that are reporting against nature-related management risks. And so what this is saying to me is that it's going to make a difference when TNFD becomes incorporated as part of the ISSB standard framework. When S3 comes into play, perhaps in the next 2 years, we're going to see a ramp up of companies that are starting then to look at the reporting of nature-related risks and how you manage them within that. But overall, I think the outlook is really positive in the Asia-Pacific region around businesses and companies that are really taking the effort to report on what they're doing and really managing nature-related risks. So if you're an investor in the room, this is the place to invest in terms of where we're seeing companies actually take into consideration overall risks to climate, but also nature. And with that, hot to go. So referencing my current favorite singer, Chappelle Rowan, take-home messages from this session. So first is really to think about nature not as a separate piece, but really as a combination in overall sustainability, and to link that with your climate risk management. Secondly is, we've looked at this already, Asia Pacific has a very high level of total GVA that is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So it really pays to look at what that means in terms of your exposure, financial exposure, investment exposure. Nature disclosure is built on the same fundamentals as climate disclosure. So if you're already reporting on climate, the next step to nature is not that far to make. And finally, when we look at expectations for nature disclosure, it's already there. It's coming fast and furious. But also, we know that the TNFD reporting is picking up. Despite the lack of regulation and mandate on this, but we also know that it is partly being driven by the need to prepare for the eventuality of ISSB, IFRS S3 adoption. And with that, I'll end with a Q&A session. We can go back to that, but also, if you want to download PwC's sustainability report, Sustainability Count 3, click on the QR code. But in any case, we've got 2 minutes and a bit left, and just opening it up for any questions, if you have any. If not, enjoy lunch and the rest of your day. Any questions? Thank you. And I'll leave you with the QR code, and I'll be here if you want to talk to me. I can hand you my card. But in any case, thank you very much, everyone.